And it is time for us to get started. All right. So welcome and thank you for joining us on the 2022 workshop style webinar, Arts Education for All, Advocate and Lobby to Bolster Collective Impact. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, the Senior Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts, and I'm wearing a floral black and yellow dress with pearl earrings. My hair is pulled back and I am brown-skinned. Before we begin our 90-minute workshop style webinar, please take a minute to review the Zoom features so you can have an optimal experience with us today. So we can go to the next slide, Steve. Steve is our tech person here today, so you can reach out to Steve if you need anything. Name, Grantmakers in the Arts. So first and foremost, we'll get to that next slide in a moment, I know it, but you can still sit tight and listen. First and foremost, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat there we go, by clicking on the chat symbol at the bottom of your screen, and make sure you're sending to everyone, not one person directly. And when we get into the discussion section of the presentation, that'll be much later on, you can feel free to use the raise a hand feature to unmute and speak, as well as the chat as always. And lastly, if you'd like your experience to include live captioning, there should be a CC box at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. And so you can click on that and get captioning as you select show subtitles. So those are some of our features. And so we're excited to begin. Thank you for joining us. So back in 2020, we revisited the topic of advocacy and lobbying with artist Fabiana Rodriguez. You might have joined us for that webinar, and advocacy trainer Abby Levine. And since then, Grantmakers in the Arts has continued to keep a pulse on what's happening at Capitol Hill, and recently introduced the Arts Education for All Act poses an opportunity for cultural stakeholders and the public to advocate and lobby for issues outlined within the bill. And we are very glad to have all of these incredible guests with us today who can offer some of their own experiences and knowledge on how you can get more involved with funding or participating in lobbying and advocacy and getting more involved with the Arts Education for All Act. And so today joining us, we have Jamie Kasper, the director at Arts Education Partnership, Erin Grant, associate at Penn Hill Group, Isaac Brown, legislative counsel at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, Jessica Mele, program officer for performing arts at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Krystal Johnson, project manager at Arts Ed Partnership, Arts Education Partnerships, and Alex Nock, principal at Penn Hill Group. And so you can read more about them here. I'm dropping in the chat. You can read more about them at that link that I just dropped in the chat. And after everyone's presentations, we're going to go into some smaller group, sort of office hours style conversations so that you can ask specific questions to a specific presenter that resonates most with your advocacy and lobbying journey where you are right now. So hold on to your questions until then, and we'll make sure we get to them. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. So Erin, why don't you kick us off?
Hello, good afternoon, good morning. I'm Erin Grant, and I'm going to begin by just briefly going over the Arts Education for All Act with some context around the bill as well as its broad goals. So the Arts Education for All Act was introduced in October of 2021, so not too long ago, by Reps Bonamici, Pingree, and Ledger Fernandez. And on this slide, you'll see some of the broad major goals of the Arts Education for All Act, which include addressing the gap in access to arts education and increasing access in underserved communities, as well as clarifying how federal funds for arts education can be used, expanding arts education programming to all Americans, including young learners and those involved in the justice system, and support arts education research to inform elementary and secondary outcomes. So these next two slides are going to focus on some of the key provisions in the Arts Education for All Act. And you can find more details about this act on both Rep. Bonamici's website as well as the Grantmakers website, which discusses the act in detail. But for now, just to highlight some of these broad important provisions, the Arts Education for All Act expands the ability to use the Child Care Development Block Grant for arts programming, as well as expanding Elementary and Secondary Education Act plan requirements to clarify how states can support and encourage arts education. It also requires state ESSA reporting to include arts courses and increases opportunities for local education agencies' support for professional development for arts teachers and the integration of the arts. To go through some more of these key provisions, the Arts Education for All Act also maximizes partnerships with community arts organizations to increase creative youth development in after-school and summer programming. It also enhances the coordination of services and activities for those involved in the juvenile justice and delinquency system prevention programs with state and local arts agencies, with the goal to improve overall participation and reduce recidivism. Finally, the Arts Education for All Act enhances research activities at the Institution for Education Sciences through a focus on arts and arts education research. And finally, before we go into some details on what advocacy and lobbying around this bill can look like, we wanted to point out a few reasons why the Arts Education for All Act is important and why you might want to advocate for this bill. And there are many reasons that this bill is important to the arts community, the education community, and other communities. So I want to make clear that this list and this slide is not exhaustive. However, as you can see from the slide, the bill so far has garnered the support of many members of Congress, which you can see listed in the bottom left of the slide, as well as many different arts advocacy organizations, including Grantmakers in the Arts, Americans for the Arts, and others, which can also be found on the Grantmakers website. Finally, the act is the largest and broadest arts education policy act to be introduced in Congress, and it focuses on access and equity, which is very important. And this bill has the potential to make a huge positive impact on the arts education world. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alex Nock, to discuss some more details on advocacy and lobbying.
Thanks, Erin. Good afternoon and good morning to everybody. So I think it's really cool that you guys are here on this webinar for two reasons. One, about everything that Erin just talked about, because this really is the broadest and largest and most expansive arts education bill ever introduced in Congress. So that's really cool right there. If you learn nothing more in this webinar, that's one of the most important things. But the other thing that's really important is, what is advocacy? You guys are, if you're on this webinar, you're starting to think about, or you've thought about, well, how do I get involved? How do I kind of maximize, my policy goals? Who do I talk to? What does it mean if I start talking to legislators or other policymakers at the federal or state level? So it's really cool that you're here, first of all, because we get to talk, but second of all, because you're starting to take that step to think about, how do I get my ideas out there? As I was just telling Erin before we got on, the really cool thing about advocacy, or if you're going to use the L word in terms of lobbying, is it's really about getting your ideas in the hands of policymakers that can actually start changing a law, a regulation, a practice, and actually affect real people's lives, right? I always tell people that if you have some great ideas and you keep them to yourselves, you might as well have never had the great ideas, right? Because no one can act upon them. If you're not a legislator, or you're not the president of the United States, or the Speaker of the House, or something like that, what can you do with your great ideas? You need to take them to the people that know and are part of the process and that represent you in Congress or the state legislature. So enough about, you can tell I'm enthusiastic about this. So hopefully that's coming through. But you do need to know the rules of the road, because we do want to keep you guys safe and not in trouble while you're doing this. But it's good to step out and think about this. So I just want to say right from the jump, all information included here is not intended to constitute legal advice, but I think it will give you a foundation to think about, how do I go about doing this? So what is advocacy? Advocacy can take many, many forms, and not all advocacy is lobbying. We're going to talk about the difference there, but advocacy really is about, hey, getting your ideas out there and starting to talk to people, thinking about how you can present something to a set of folks to get them to take up your cause. Nonprofits i.e. public charities, can advocate. Nonprofits can also lobby with certain restrictions, and we'll go over those certain restrictions. But the great thing about this is you can actually use the things we talk about today to actually advance the Arts Education for All Act. Maybe there's a member of Congress that you didn't see on that list that should be co-sponsoring that bill. Contact them. Tell them you think it's a good idea to do that. I think one of the most important things about entering this space, though, is really think about what you want to advocate on, how, and to what extent. So, the organization just goes, hey, we're going to lobby a little bit. Usually that can either turn out to be something that never results in actually any effort, or it results in getting people possibly in trouble because you're not thinking about a couple of key things to think about. Organizational commitment. If you're going to lobby or advocate and you're going to have on your 990 or you're going to take the H election, we'll talk about that in a second, that's definitely something that your executive director and your board should be thinking about as a strategy. How much do you want to deploy advocacy and lobbying? Again, we're going to talk about this H election in just a little bit, but how much of what you do every day in your activities is an important part to think about, and strategic decisions about when to utilize advocacy or lobbying. When are we going to push this forward in a legislative way or an administrative way if you're talking about the federal government or a governor's office or even a state educational agency, depending on your state laws. So just important things to think about from the big picture here. So advocacies or avenues for advocacy. It's everything from organizing folks to think about how to move forward on, educating legislators, getting to know the legislators, educational conference, doing research, looking at what regulations or guidance might be put out by an agency at the state or federal level. Believe it or not, includes litigation. Certainly there's the concept of educating the public, influencing business partners and corporations. There's straight up lobbying, and then obviously training people to think about how to go out and do a lot of this work. And what can my organization do, you may be asking yourself, to advocate for the Arts Education for All Act? Well, let's think about who you are, right? Because that's an important context here. Are you a 501c3, essentially what we'd call a nonprofit if we're using generic terms? You can do some limited lobbying activities. You can do more if you choose the H election. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. You cannot support or oppose a candidate for office as that organization. You obviously as an individual in the world can do whatever you want in that sense, but your organization can't support or oppose a specific candidate for office. If you're a private foundation, you are prohibitively taxed on lobbying activities, and you also can't support or oppose a candidate for office. If you're a 501c4, notice the 4 rather than the 3, it's a slightly different nonprofit. You have unlimited lobbying activities. Those are nonprofits set up to, when someone has a 4 designation, they are set up to lobby. That is really one of the primary reasons for setting that up. And you can support or oppose candidates for office as a secondary activity. Again, not your primary activity, but as a secondary activity. And so one of the big things, you're like, all right, I'm a 501c3. I haven't taken the H election. Again, we're going to talk about that for a second, in a second. Being like, what can I do? So essentially, your lobbying activities have to be an insubstantial part of your overall activities, not the resources you spend on lobbying, but the actual activities of an organization. And guess what? The IRS has never done a really great job of defining that. It's kind of like you see it when you know it kind of thing. There are some parameters around it, so we're going to talk about it. And I think that the reason for the IRS probably never really defining this is there is a lot of gray here. What is really a substantial activity versus an insubstantial activity can get. So insubstantial, there is some case law with respect to whether it's 5% of your activities and things like that. You definitely want some legal advice on this, but if it's not, it's really a small part of the work you're doing is what you want to be looking at. The lobbying activities aren't really defined by the IRS. There's some basic things like it is lobbying to contact a member of a legislative body and say, please pass this bill or support this bill. That kind of, think about if you were to look at a lobbyist on TV, it's like them going around saying, hey, support this bill. It seems kind of obvious in its face, but, if you urge the public to do that too, it gets messy after that, in terms of what, may or may not be lobbying. And again, I stress this, but it is activities based. It's not money based. It's not if you spend $1, it's if what portion of your activities. And there are penalties, tax penalties, if you do violate these things, and you are technically in some way, shape, or form violating your 501c3 nonprofit status. Now, don't get scared about that, right? Because if you were to embark on this, you would systemically think about, again, remember those questions I asked at the beginning. Do you have your ED and board on board, so to speak? Do you have them thinking like you do? And then lastly, what are you going to use this for? This is a tool that you can use to advance certain things. So think about it strategically in that way. And then the H election. So I've referenced this several times. Essentially what this does is it allows you to spend a higher percentage of resources on lobbying, right? So if you are setting up a 501c3 and you take the H election, it means you're going to be spending a little more of your activities and resources on lobbying than a normal C3 would. This gives you a little extra insurance. You can see some of the limits there. I won't kind of go into them. You can certainly look at the slides at your leisure, but it gives you more room to say, all right, well, we're not just spending a little bit of time. We can actually attack something head on, as long as it's not the only thing or the majority of what we are doing out there. So again, some people think of the H election as, oh, that makes me a real lobbyist. It also provides you real protection in case someone audits you and says, what are you spending your time on? And here with an H election, some of the things you can do direct communications, you can talk to a legislator, you can express a specific viewpoint around a legislation, you can work with grassroots folks, members, or other folks that you're encouraging to also reach out, that you can also express a specific view around a specific piece of legislation or do a call to action. Please reach out to your members of Congress on these sort of things. Now, there are some exceptions to what is lobbying, and many of you have probably encountered this, and these are important exceptions because it gets you out of this insubstantial tests, it gets you out of needing the H election. So if you are doing partisan analysis, study, or research, that is not lobbying. Looking at a problem and saying, here are the parameters of the problem, here are some solutions. Again, maybe not saying pass HR 555, right, to do that, but you are saying, here's the problem and here are some solutions. It has to represent a full and fair discussion of the issues, has to be broadly disseminated. You can do that by sending it out by email or putting it on your website, and you can express a point of view. You can do an incorrect. You definitely don't want to do an incorrect call to action. You want to do an indirect call to action. And that can be something like, we need to solve this problem, right? But not, again, passing HR 555. So that's just things to think about with respect to that. Oh, and I went too fast, sorry. Requests for technical assistance, i.e. a legislator contacts you and says, I need help figuring out how to solve this problem. Can you please help me because you have expertise? If you are invited in writing by a government official, that is not lobbying. They are asking you. You are not asking them. And again, once you're doing that, you may express a view on a specific piece of legislation. They're asking you. They may ask you, what do you think of this bill? What do you think of this regulation? That is directly asking for that sort of stuff. And then self-defense, obviously it kind of sounds like what it sounds like. You can talk to a legislator or a judicial body or an administrative body if you are essentially asserting, hey, we have done this and we think we've done it right. You definitely should consult an attorney whenever you're getting into legal issues around self-defense. And then examinations and discussions, if you're forming a blue ribbon panel, an annual report, all these are sort of like that research and analysis sort of thing I talked about earlier, where you're essentially making a large call for something like that. And you do not want to do a call for action in these sort of things, right? Because you are essentially saying, here's the problem, here's the solution, but you do not say, and go out and talk to your members of Congress about how to solve that. That's something you don't want to include there. So that is the end of my presentation. I am now going to turn it over to Isaac.
Thanks, Alex. And hi, everyone. It's great to be with you here today. Again, my name is Isaac Brown, and I serve as the Legislative Counsel for NASA, which stands for the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. So as I mentioned, NASA is the professional association of the nation's 56 state and jurisdictional arts agencies. We are a national, not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization that champions public support for the arts in America. As Alex noted very well previously, it is very important to note right away that even though our members are public agencies, often with leadership appointed by government officials, it is wholly appropriate for them to advocate for the arts in their states and at the federal level. In fact, state arts agencies play a critical role in shaping policies by leveraging their profile and expertise to highlight an important issue like funding for arts education initiatives. State arts agencies are also able to utilize the state's resources and data to make compelling and cohesive arguments for policymakers to consider when they're considering the implications of a particular policy. It is also really important to note, and Alex spoke to this too earlier, policies with regard to engagement from public agencies and nonprofits. You must remember that there isn't a one-size-fits-all sort of standard for what that engagement looks like. So particularly if you are working for a public agency and you're contemplating either advocating or directly lobbying on a particular issue, I would encourage you to consult with your internal counsel to ensure that your planned activities comply with state law. So on my next few slides, I thought I would provide a couple of examples of state arts agencies utilizing their resources and perch as a government agency to effectively support the arts in their state. The first state I would like to highlight is Tennessee, where, like every state, artists and creative businesses were hit hard by the onset of COVID-19. Before the pandemic, the creative economy in Tennessee was thriving, infusing the state with $1.2 billion that supported nearly 40,000 jobs and attracted 18.6 million attendees to events annually. However, like most of the country, arts nonprofits in Tennessee responded to the pandemic by canceling events and closing their doors, which resulted in significant economic harm. Over the 13-month period that ended in March 2021, so even a year ago, the 22 largest arts and culture nonprofits in the state reported losing $120 million in revenue. The Tennessee Arts Commission responded to this crisis right away by conducting a full-scale survey of the impact to the state's economy that resulted from the loss of arts income and revenue. With that data in hand, and by releasing that information to the public, the commission applied for $80 million in funds made available through passage of the American Relief Plan. Because this data was made public, not only was the Arts Commission able to make their case to the governor and members of the legislature, but like-minded stakeholders like the State Arts Advocacy Organization was able to also mobilize behind the effort. And ultimately, the state was granted their funding request of $80 million that they were then able to return back to the arts community. For my second case study, I'd like to highlight the efforts undertaken in South Carolina to oppose funding for the State Arts Agency there. Early in her first term as governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley and her administration made the decision that the state should no longer fund the State Arts Agency, despite long-standing bipartisan support for the organization. In fiscal years 2012, 2013, and 2014, the governor vetoed the Art Commission's budget. It's worth noting that while the arts were widely supported in the state, Governor Haley, much as she is seen today, was viewed as a rising star by her party and by her state. And so her efforts to defund the Arts Commission was certainly taken as a very, very serious threat to the long-term viability of the Arts Commission in South Carolina. In reaction to this threat, the State Arts Agency knew that they would need to be very strategic in how they responded by highlighting the clear role the arts have in supporting diverse communities throughout the state. The agency focused on the intersection of the arts and education, as well as the benefits for rural communities, and released clear data that would make the governor's cuts feel real and tangible to its residents. Advocates were then able to utilize this data to push back and build alliances within the legislature. As you can see on the slide, not only after several failed efforts did the governor ultimately change her position and stop recommending elimination of the Arts Commission, but the commission was able to have its budget grow despite efforts to undermine the agency's existence. So as we have reflected on the incredible success that we saw both in Tennessee and in South Carolina, one of the clear connections between the two cases was the significant effort that was undertaken to demonstrate the impact of these proposals and what they would mean for the state's residents. We have come to believe firmly that a one-size-fits-all approach is rarely successful in cases of advocacy and lobbying, because ultimately the political power lies with the voter. And therefore, it's important for public agencies and nonprofits to really tailor the case for government investment based upon the specific wishes and concerns of the constituents with whom that they are trying to reach. I think that I will stop there, but I look forward to continuing this conversation. So thank you all very much.
Hey everyone, sorry, getting my screens all centered around here. I'm Jamie Kasper, Arts Education Partnership, joining you from my home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or I should say outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, and want to invite my colleague Krystal to also introduce herself so that when her slides come up a little bit later, she doesn't have to do that in the middle. Krystal?
Hello everyone, I'm Krystal, project manager at AEP. I am a young Black female. I'm currently wearing a multicolored floral button down with, I guess, dark brown and copperish brown ends, curly fro. I am here joining from Maryland, and I pass it back to you.
Thanks, Krystal. Great, and to build on Krystal's description, I am a middle-aged white woman. I have shoulder length, light brown, dark blonde, curly hair. I'm wearing a blue top with a white sweater, and behind me are all the plants that are very happy to be back out in our sunroom after spending the winter inside. Krystal and I are happy to talk with you today about AEP's resources that might help you in your advocacy and lobbying efforts. So the Arts Education Partnership, or we're going to refer to it as AEP from here on in, believes that arts and education leaders do better work when they're connected to powerful information and resources. Every day we connect our partners who are passionate about arts learning to the knowledge and people that help them do great things. And we do this because well-informed leaders are crucial to ensuring that learners have access to an excellent arts education. And you may or may not know that AEP is part of Education Commission of the State. So we're going to refer to that as ECS. ECS is an organization that supports state policymakers by providing connection opportunities and information centered on education policy. And AEP was created 27 years ago by our two federal partner agencies. That's the National Endowment for the Arts, U.S. Department of Education. Because AEP is part of ECS, and ECS is governed by state legislators and governors from all over the political spectrum, and AEP is supported primarily by federal funds, we have to remain politically neutral and offer nonpartisan information. You saw some of that language on Alex's slides earlier. So with that in mind, Krystal and I are going to focus on sharing resources that can help you learn more about various aspects of the Arts Education for All bill. And Sherilyn, in just a minute, is going to reshare the link to the webinar page on the GIA website, where you'll find a document with all of this information, including links. So if you don't feel like you need to take notes while we share these pieces with you. So what we're going to do is crosswalk specific language from the bill with some resources both from AEP and our partner organizations. So we're going to start with the bill's Title I, which is about early childhood education programs. And you see on the left side of your screen the language that is pulled directly from the bill. And I want to share that over the past 27 years, we've grown to a network of over 150 partner and affiliate organizations working at all levels, so local, state, national, and they're working on all aspects of arts education, school-based, community-based, home-based, and everything in between. One of our partners, Wolf Trap Institute for Early Learning Through the Arts, provides evidence-based professional programs and support for early education nationwide. So if you're interested in Title I and specifically Section 101 of the Arts Education for All bill, I urge you to explore the resources that Wolf Trap has to offer. And next, there we go. Going into Title II, so this is amendments to the ESEA, or the current iteration, ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. Specifically Section 202 that talks about state and local plans. We have our Arts Ed Search research database, and there you can filter studies to see outcomes focused specifically on arts integration, since this is what this piece is talking about. You can also find lots of other research if you're interested in reading about outcomes, and that's outcomes for students, outcomes for educators, social emotional outcomes, academic outcomes, and everything in between. Also in Section 202, it mentions sequential instruction in arts courses offered specifically in the legislation through grades 6 through 12. I wanted to share the National Core Arts Standards because they provide a really great example of sequential learning in all 5 arts disciplines, all the way from kindergarten through high school. So that's a great resource for you if you're interested in learning more about that piece of the bill. This report by Terry Peterson and Deborah Lowe-Vandal highlights some of the evidence base for summer enrichment and comprehensive after-school programs, and there are dedicated sections that highlight arts programs in both of those spaces. We have another resource called ESSA Mapping Opportunities for the Arts, and this is an AEP resource that includes chapters on state plans, stakeholder engagement, well-rounded education, and tiers of evidence. Now, just a note about this slide, what you're seeing on the left is not language from the bill, but is instead the original policy language from the Every Student Succeeds Act as referenced by the bill. So just want to be sure that you're understanding where that language is coming from there. All right, so Alex mentioned earlier that one of the pieces of the bill requires that the arts be included on state report cards as part of their ESSA reporting. Some of the resources from our parent organization, as I mentioned earlier, Education Commission of the States, compile information about the status of arts education data collection across the country. And in fact, there is an entire state data infrastructure project for arts education that includes reports on the status of arts education across states and also includes case studies from individual states if you're interested in learning more. We built on that initial data work with a blog post in May of last year. So I co-authored that blog post with 2 of my ECS colleagues about what's going on with data collection across the United States. And this post includes a dashboard where you can see a broad overview of the country, which states collect arts education data, and then you can click on states and see exactly what data they collect, and you can find links to those. So just really useful if you're interested in learning more specifically for this part of the bill. All right, and last resource I'm going to share before I turn it over to Krystal for the next piece is this part from the school improvement. So Section 203 school improvement specifically talks about teaching artists. The asset map that's published by the Teaching Artists Guild is a tool where you can search for teaching artists and organizations that employ teaching artists in the United States and elsewhere. So this is just a snapshot of that map. Each of those dots is either an individual teaching artist or an organization that employs teaching artists, and you can click on those dots and learn more about them. Krystal, I'm going to pass to you to talk about ArtScan in Section 206 of the bill.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm back, folks. So Section 206 talks about local education agencies focused on increasing pathways to teacher certifications and licensure. So AEP has a resource that is updated annually, as Jamie mentioned, called ArtScan. And this resource tracks these policies in all 50 states, the District of Columbia. And with our latest update release at the end of this month, the Department of Defense and Education Activity, which is acronym BODEA, and they serve around 70,000 students whose parents or guardians are serving in the military. So we update this resource with the help of our parent organization, ECS. They do the research and policy, and ArtScan is based on state statute, law, and regulation. And we also cover budget if it's in that statute or regulation language. And we also update this resource with one of our partners, the State Education Agency Directors of Arts Education. And so that's a great resource to look at for, we cover 15 policy areas right now, but specifically with teachers, teaching licensures and certifications that can also be found under ArtScan. Next slide for me, Jamie. So here we're talking about the Section 207, which is community learning centers partnering, integrating, and utilizing offerings provided by arts services organizations or community-focused arts nonprofits and organizations for the furtherment of creative youth development. So the Creative Youth Development National Partnership actually works to drive collective action in 3 strategic priorities to advance creative youth development, which is in visibility and impact, funding, and field building. Next slide for me, please, Jamie. So an additional resource that can be, that we like to highlight here is from the Lewis Prize for Music, which is also another AEP partner organization. They publish Make Casting Towards Just Futures. And this report outlines the CYD field's contribution to the personal, community, and civic health of young people. So now we're gonna transition over to Title III resources, which focuses on juvenile justice in the arts. So here we are talking specifically about Section 301. And so AEP actually was charged by our grant organizations, National Endowment for the Arts and US Department of Ed, to start digging deeply into juvenile justice in the arts a few years back. And so we created a resource library for juvenile justice in the arts that's found on our website. And this also includes 2 policy reports that AEP has done, and the reports discuss how some states are coordinating services, activities for juvenile justice in the arts with local agencies and organizations, and how they're collaborating. In addition, AEP's Arts Ed Amplified blog, we recently completed a series on juvenile justice in the arts. And these posts were basically about storytelling, which we learned from our research in our prior reports is really important when it comes to funding and bringing about more arts ed programming, effective arts ed programming for students who are learning while housed in these juvenile justice facilities. And so what these posts have, we have youth who also wrote for our blog series, some who are working in solidarity of those who have been learning while in the juvenile justice system, and also those who have that shared experience from being in the juvenile justice system. We also had arts organizations contribute by providing programming insights that they are utilizing to conduct arts programs within juvenile justice system for young folks. And that's it for me. So I'll pass it along to Jamie.
Great. Thanks, Krystal. Yeah, wrapping us up then before we go to our next folks, we wanted to wrap up with Title IV, which is about assessment and data. So wanted to share just a couple last resources for this section with you. The National Endowment for the Arts currently funds 2 NEA research labs that are focused on arts, creativity, cognition, and learning. So if you're looking at Section 401, arts research in that bill, that is a really great resource for you to check out. Going back to something we talked about earlier, the statewide data infrastructure project, part of that work is the Arts Education Data Toolkit. So again, this is from Education Commission of the States. It contains instructions, worksheets, and sample documents to help states manage an arts education data initiative from start to finish. So if you are working on lobbying and advocacy for the Arts Education for All bill, and you encounter someone who says, well, this part of the bill is great, I have no idea how to do it, this will give you everything you need to pass on to them to say, okay, this is how you do it. Here are the tools to help you from start to finish. Right. And the bills has a section specifically on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Most of you probably know that in 2019, the National Assessment Governing Board removed the Arts National Assessment of Educational Progress from their calendars. This was a very important tool for gauging student achievement, specifically in music and visual arts when it was conducted the last time. And that is now gone from their assessment calendar. So we maintain a page on our website with information and multiple resources about this issue. So again, if this is a part of the bill you're really interested in focusing on, you have that link in the resource list to everything that you need to kind of get up to speed on this part of the issue. All right, and that is it for Krystal and I sharing AEP and our partner resources related to the Arts Education for All Act.
Thanks, guys. Jamie and Krystal, I really appreciate that like granular dive into the sections of the bill. Thank you. So I'm Jessica Mele. I am coming to you from Ohlone Ramaytush land in Menlo Park, California. I'm a white woman wearing a denim blazer, clear rimmed glasses, and chin length blondish brownish hair. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am sitting in my office, which is very exciting. It's been a long time since I've been back here, and I just want to say hi to some grantees and friends that I see in the participant list. Chelsea and Althea, Sarah Brothers from Santa Cruz, whose our paths have crossed many times, Sarah and Katie at Music Man Foundation, Tom and Randy. It's nice to see you all and have so many compatriots here. That's the end of my romper room. My romper room introduction. I'm here to talk to you a little bit from the private philanthropy point of view about how we go about and think about funding policy and advocacy at the Hewlett Foundation. There's some in this presentation that is redundant from earlier presenters. I'll just speed through it, but my goal is to provide resources to funders who maybe have done a little bit of this kind of funding before or haven't at all and would like some resources or case studies in how to fund advocacy and policy work with a particular focus in arts education, which is our focus. So moving the slides forward. So I'll start with 2 resources that you may or may not know. Alliance for Justice and their Boulder Advocacy Program. I've referred many grantees to them. And they can advise 501c3 nonprofits on what is allowable and not allowable, how to go about certain steps when they're considering engaging in lobbying activities. The other is Learn Foundation Law. And I just tried to, the link is not translating from my Word document, but it's literally learnfoundationlaw.org. It is a web series of trainings. This is Maya, fictional program officer. It was funded by our foundation and a number of other foundations, their legal teams. Thank you very much, Sherilyn, to give a how-to to program officers about the day-to-day decisions that they make around grants that might involve lobbying and advocacy, and among many other questions. So I highly recommend it. They're super user-friendly. They're free. You don't have to log in. It's like you literally just go there and click on the videos. And there was a lot that I thought I knew coming into this job from a nonprofit where I was doing some policy and advocacy work that I didn't know when I got to these trainings and learned was really specific for folks who are working in philanthropy. So I highly recommend it if you haven't already accessed those trainings. So this I cribbed directly from Boulder Advocacy. It has some of the explaining language that you got from Alex earlier. I just wanted to show the kind of breadth of activities that can be encompassed when we say advocacy and policy, particularly, you know, in my work at the Hewlett Foundation in the Performing Arts program in arts education, we have grantees that do every one of these things. Only one of them is lobbying. You can see there are so many different ways of doing this work. And the one thing that is prohibited for all of us if we're not in a C4 is electioneering. Alex covered that pretty well earlier, so here's a nifty graphic for you. My past life really quickly is I worked at a nonprofit arts education organization called Performing Arts Workshop in San Francisco with my comrade Tom DeCaney many, many years ago, Tom also is on this call. It was, from the nonprofit perspective, we're an organization that worked directly with young people in school and out of school time. And we found that there was very little that we could do about the institutions in which we were working. Our teaching artists could create a culture in the classroom, build good relationships with the schools and with the teaching staff at those schools. But there were things that we were just not going to change with that work. That was our primary work as an organization. We needed to work to change institutions if we really wanted to achieve our goals around arts education, learning in and through the arts. So we began engaging in advocacy work. In some ways, we had always been doing that, coalition building with our peer organizations to work with the local school district about arts education in the district. So we had already been doing some of that, but things really changed when we did an advocacy plan in, Tom, I don't remember what year it was. It was funded by my predecessor in this job at the Hewlett Foundation. So we engaged in a planning process. The foundation funded that planning process because it was not a lobbying planning process. It was about how, as an organization, are we going to think strategically about the advocacy work that we do? Maybe lobbying comes up, maybe not. And we ended up, as a result of that process, doing the 501H election. And I always recommend to my grantees that they do this if they are considering doing any kind of lobbying. They are really, I have found a lot of reluctance and fear around the 501H election, that if we do this election, it makes us a target for the IRS. And I promise it is actually protective. If you get audited by the IRS, you can show them, you know, you've been tracking your expenses, you can show them how you are within compliance. So I don't know if you've experienced that, those of you who are funders, with any of your grantees, but I find that I have to do sometimes some kind of one-on-one advocacy around the 501H election and education. And then I send them on to Boulder Advocacy, or we fund Boulder Advocacy to do a workshop for our grantees. So we did that at Performing Arts Workshop. And a number of years later, when I was executive director at the organization, there was one particular opportunity we engaged in, which was this Children's Fund reauthorization in 2014. And some of the things that I was doing as an executive director at this 501c3 nonprofit were definitely direct lobbying. We were advising on legislative language. We were meeting with supervisors to advise on what language would go on the ballot proposition direct to voters in November. We did some education of our constituents, our donors, our supporters, and some organizing in support of that work. So there was a direct line between the moment when we did that 501H election and thinking more strategically about what kinds of lobbying activities are we going to engage in. The Children's Fund, by the way, directly impacted arts education in school and out of school time funding in the city of San Francisco. I'd be happy to talk more about that in the breakout if you want to hear about it. When I came to the Hewlett Foundation, there was this existing portfolio of policy and advocacy grantees in what was then our arts education strategy. It's now called our youth strategy. And we did an evaluation when I first started here on that grant making and then a refresh. We found a number of things that were actually working. You know, we've across the foundation fund a lot of policy and advocacy and women's reproductive rights out of our gender equity and governance program, in climate work out of our environment program. This was one place where we had some real wins, and I think there are some reasons for that. Number one, we were and continue to fund at multiple policy levels simultaneously. So we support work at the federal level, and some of that is through GIA, supporting the Arts Ed Funders Collaborative as one of many funders, which leads to the work with Penn Hill. Arts Education Partnership is a grantee. We have also a number of local, regional, and statewide organizations that work at policy and advocacy in California. Create California is one of them. And I think it's important to note that some of our policy wins involved direct interplay among those levels. Money that was allocated in Title IV Part A in the ESSA reauthorization somehow made it to California, and what was then the California Alliance for Arts Education supported that became a one-time funding opportunity. They supported county offices of education in California in applying for those funds, and it really did lead to additional funds on the ground in schools for arts education and arts education planning in California. Happy to talk more about that in the breakout if you want more details. We also convened these grantees together. That was disrupted by the pandemic, but when we were able to do it, and hopefully in the future, you know, we didn't tell them what they should advocate about. We didn't tell them how they should coordinate. It was more a case of these folks getting together, getting to know each other, trusting each other, and finding connections among their work. So that was another piece of the special sauce in our policy and advocacy grant making. And the grantees take on these kind of suites of activities, from coalition building to research, training, and lobbying. How to fund this work? So we fund these grantees in many different ways. I think the two things as funders you need to know are, number one, the general operating support. You know, the IRS only cares if you are directing your funds for particular lobbying efforts to push a political agenda. General operating support is a way to avoid the whole thing. We think Create California does great work. We support the suite of work that they do, one of which may be lobbying, but as soon as we make a GOS grant, we have no say in what they do. So general operating support grants are a great way to fund this kind of work, or fund organizations that do this kind of work. The second is the project grant rule. So this gets a little bit complicated, but it basically says that you're not earmarking money for lobbying, even though this project may include lobbying, and that the total amount of your grant does not exceed the total amount of non-lobbying expenses in that project's budget. I'd be happy to talk more about that later. It's not worth going into now, but essentially it helps to have other funders and to show that you are not directly supporting lobbying within that project. And that is how we support the Arts Ed Funders Collaborative at GIA, which leads to the work with Penn Hill. So project grant rule and general operating support are the two ways that we are able to fund organizations and efforts that engage in lobbying as a portion of their activities. So back to these resources, Boulder Advocacy and LearnFoundationLaw.org. I highly recommend them as funders, whether you're new to this work or whether you've been around for a while, particularly Learn Foundation Law. And I have, plenty of other examples in case, plenty of other examples in case studies, but I want to be mindful of time. So I'm happy to do that in the breakout.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for your presentations. Those were awesome. 2 thumbs up. And right now you're going to have some, like I mentioned earlier, some office hours time where you can go into the breakout of your choice to ask specific questions to your to the person who presented, who you think resonates most with your journey, right? Your advocacy lobbying journey. Also, not to fear if you're like, I have a question for 2 people. Pick one breakout, stay there for the 10 minutes. When we come back together, we will have a full group discussion. So you'll be able to ask your other question there too. So go ahead into your group. If you look at the bottom of your screen, or actually should have popped up in the center of your screen, you can select whichever breakout you want, the Penn Hill one, NASA, Arts Education Partnership, Hewlett Foundation. Click the button join for the one you'd like to join. Scroll down, yep, you've got some instructions at the top, and you'll be with your preferred speaker for the next 10 minutes. So enjoy. This is great. So feel free at this point to unmute or utilize the raise a hand feature to share out some of the things that you discussed, some of your major takeaways. And now is even a great time if you came up with any questions in your group, or like maybe sparked some conversations, sparked new questions that you want to ask other presenters. Now is a great time to do that as well. So we can actually stop sharing screen. I think that might be better for right now. We can have our sort of Brady Bunch look on our screen. And yeah, if you've got a question or have a share out that you want to share out to the group, please do raise a hand or unmute.
Shirley,
or the chat's always an option too. Yeah.
Sorry, Shirley, we had a question come up in our group that I think Alex might be better equipped to answer. And the question was, we talked a little bit about the possibility that the Arts Education for All Act may not be adopted or passed whole cloth, but instead that pieces of the legislation may show up in other legislation. And someone in our group was asking, what's the best use of advocacy energy, knowing that that may be a possibility?
Yeah, hey, Jamie, I'm happy to respond to that. So one, the more folks that co-sponsor, folks, when I say folks, I say that a lot in my talk, I mean members of Congress. The more members of Congress that co-sponsor that bill, the better, because it shows a wide swath of support, both numbers and hopefully some Republicans as well on that, because then that drives that vehicle to be a more prominent vehicle in the specific committee's mind that has jurisdiction over that, which would be the House Education and Labor Committee. So Bonamici herself, who is the lead author of that bill, is looking to do exactly what you just said, Jamie, as you know, use portions of that bill as different subject matter comes up. And we were just talking about that strategy with Randy a little bit in our breakout room. So yeah, it's unlikely, as you just said, Jamie, that the Arts Education for All Act moves as a standalone separate bill. But it is something that when, hey, a K-12 bill comes up, let's move some of this ESEA stuff. When a juvenile justice bill comes up, let's incorporate that juvenile justice stuff. When an IES, which is DC speak for the Institute of Educational Sciences or the Department of Education's research arm, comes up, let's incorporate that research focus on arts education. All those are very viable, but the more folks that can support the bill as a whole right now is really what Bonamici needs to show like mass adoption on that sort of approach.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. Jess, there were like 1 million people in your room. Did anything come up from your group that, and not necessarily you being the one to share, but anyone from that group? I was like, what's happening in there? There's like a party happening over there.
I talked a lot and I hope it was helpful, but I'd love if anyone from the group didn't get a question, that had a question they didn't get to ask, I'd welcome that. I gave a case study of some of our policy funding, moving through different policy systems. And then there was a question about how to support program delivery grantees, arts education program grantees, in engaging in policy and advocacy.
That's great. All right, anyone have any big takeaways or questions for another presenter? And if you're shy, you can also share in the chat. All right, I guess we're good on that front. If anything, you come up with anything or remember anything that happened in your breakouts, feel free to unmute, share out, or drop in the chat. But we do have some questions that did come in for you, our presenters. So please do sit tight, everyone, and we'll get into these. So this is actually for you, Jamie and Krystal. So get ready. So based on the work that you do, what's the easiest starting point for you? You know, when you're thinking about early childhood or K-12 education or assessment and data collection, when we're thinking about juvenile justice.
Krystal, do you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. So the first step is we get the okay from our federal partners and our parent organization that, you know, this is something that issue that we really need to focus on and look into. And so our first step is, of course, research, whether it's reaching out to our partnership and doing some independent research. We also look into legislation as well. We're focused on, I don't know if Jamie said this, but we're focused on state by state legislation. We do cover some federal legislation when we don't see a lot of state movement on its own, but we typically just focus on what's happening in each state because it varies depending on the area. And once we do our research, we try to convene a group of experts to, you know, kind of help bring that narrative together. And we do reports, or we'll do a convening where we'll gather folks like a webinar and talk to folks about what we've learned and what we're still hoping to learn. We're always inviting more resources and more knowledge to come in so that we can continue to help build and evolve our research. So that's typically where we begin. And Jamie, if you want to fill in any areas that I might have skipped over.
You didn't skip over any, but I do have something to add. And that is for you all, if you're interested in digging more into any of those systems that you might not be familiar with, I want to share a resource with you that is not on the resource list because we just published it a couple of weeks ago. This is our brand new Components of an Arts Education and Student Wellness Ecosystem piece. And what it does is it attempts to show how disparate systems work together with students in the center. So I think part of the answer to how might we collectively start to approach this work is to not center the systems and learn about the systems, but to center the learner and think about the systems that impact them. And this particular resource looks at the education, arts, health and human services, and juvenile justice systems and how they all interact. And then the second page of the resource outlines specific policies, agencies and actors and actions at the federal, state, and local levels that align to each of those entities. So it's just a way to help us conceptualize a system in a new way or maybe through a new lens.
That's great. Thank you. And I see that you've dropped a link into the chat. So please bring your attention there if you have not done so already. Next question goes for you, Isaac. So you primarily work with state arts agencies, obviously. You are the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. Are there any particular questions that you've received that come up frequently that, you know, might be misconceptions that you kind of just want to like clear up now or debunk now for folks to know? And even if you know, opportunity to share with others, right? Like if you come across other folks who need to unlearn some of the past narratives that they've learned.
Well, I mean, the folks on this call or on the Zoom, I think, know this firsthand. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I really had coming into this position, and maybe this was a legacy of my time on Capitol Hill, was this notion that support for the arts has to be a sort of a partisan wedge issue. And, you know, certainly in decades past, it absolutely was used in the most hyper partisan ways to sort of bridge divides between the two parties. But it's been really reassuring in my time working with NASA to see, you know, the fact of the matter is at the state level, they just don't have the time or the energy or patience for some of the things that go on here at the federal level. They've got to balance their budgets and they need to deliver for their residents. And so it's been really nice to see states working together sort of regardless of political ideology in support of the arts and really understanding the value that comes from investing in the arts and what it means for their communities. And then the second thing, which, I think I don't want to step on Alex's great presentation, but the other thing that we do spend a lot of time talking to our members about are sort of what advocacy does mean, what lobbying means, and what sort of triggers one type of action over another. I do think that's incredibly important. So the last thing, just to reiterate, it's something I said in my slides, especially for the folks participating in our webinar today that are working for public agencies, please do consult with your internal counsel, who I'm sure would be happy to talk to you about any activities that you have planned. There is absolutely an appropriate way and an effective way for you to be able to interface with members of your legislature at the state level, or certainly in Congress here in Washington. And so just understanding what those guidelines are, and then feel free to reach out to me, to NASA, and anyone on this Zoom, I'm sure, if you have extra questions about that.
Awesome. Thank you, Isaac. And at the end of the presentation, we are going to be sending out the slides. We'll be sending out a recording of this. And the slides do include all the contact information of the presenters. So no worries, you will get all of that. Next question is for you, Jess. So you, in your presentation, yes, surprise. In your presentation, you talked about kind of like the two roles that you've played from the nonprofit side and the funder side. And so with that, what are some of the kind of things that you've put top of mind now as a funder, because you've been on the side of the nonprofit, where it's like, these are some of the things that I should prioritize as a funder if I'm going to support a nonprofit in their advocacy and lobbying efforts? And I mean, that's basically, you talked a lot about that in your presentation, but things that you might not have realized had you not been on the nonprofit side before, if anything. I know, I just sprung it on you.
No, it's okay. I'm trying to think of how to answer that question. I think I was fortunate in that I worked in an organization where my predecessor, Tom, kind of paved the way with the board around doing advocacy. And the organization, also the board at the time, was very on board, for lack of a better term, was very on board with that. I know many of my grantees do not benefit from a board that understands advocacy and is willing to take the risk, however small, however well calculated, however beneficial that risk might be. And so, part of that is just being understanding with my grantees that they have hoops they need to navigate, that as a funder, I think just coming into philanthropy, not having worked in a nonprofit, I wouldn't know what those challenges are, the intricacies of working with a board, and also just as a stressed out ED, which I was, not knowing what resources to turn to, and really needing help and turning to my funder for that help, for what resources to turn to when I didn't have any, I didn't have, in other cases, I didn't have an HR director. I was the HR director. I didn't have, I didn't have a bookkeeper. I didn't have a finance director. I was a finance director. And I didn't have a lobbying advocacy director. I was that person. And so I have, as a program officer, served as an advisor to grantees. And when I was a grantee, I really sought out my program officer for that advice. And even if it's just like, go to this resource over here, I found that to be really helpful as a grantee. Does that answer your question?
It does. It absolutely does. To me, it does. I mean, I'm not a grantee or funder, but to me, it answers the question. And as I said, you'll have the contact information of our presenters if you need a little bit more afterwards. I have one more question before I ask my final question. And this is for you, Penn Hill representative group. So Alex and Erin, So if someone wants to lobby and they're not sure if they should do or use the H election, how do they decide whether or not to do that?
So I would think of the H election as a security blanket in a way, right?
Okay.
It allows you more room to maneuver, to think about what activities you're going to conduct, what expenditures you're going to make. And it just provides a bit of a safe harbor. Some people will think of taking the H election as oh boy, we are advertising that we are lobbying. Again, I don't really think of lobbying as a bad thing. I think it's someone taking their ideas to policymakers that can change laws and regulations and make good changes in the world, right? To move the policy people support forward. But the H election gives you more of a sure window into what you can do. So the H election isn't a bad thing. I view it as a good thing that provides clear parameters around what you can do. And your auditor then can't go, well, wait, was that insubstantial or not? No, there's clear numerical kind of things to follow at that point. So don't think it's a bad thing. It's a good thing.
You really do need to have the financial systems in place, though, to track your expenses. And I think for small organizations, that's a real barrier. And so, you know, I would consider as a funder, some organizational effectiveness support or an additional grant to a grantee to get their financial systems to a place where they can track those kinds of expenses.
Great point.
That's great. Thank you for that. When I keep hearing you talk about the 501H election, I think protection 501H election. That's like how it like stays in my brain. I'm like, nice. Like we have a song now, so feel free to sing that if you forget. And finally, any last words that any of our presenters want to share with the group before we sign off? All right.
Thanks for coming and joining us.
Yes, that was sweet. Yes, thank you so much. That was awesome. So like Krystal said, thank you all for coming and joining us today. Thank you to all of our presenters. You did such an excellent job and we all learned a lot. I'm speaking for everyone right now, but I know we all learned a lot. The presentation was recorded, so we'll be sending you a link to the recording file and the presentation slides afterwards, so you can look out for that in your email. We'll also be sharing out a link to our survey because we keep that going. There we go. So because we want to see how you felt about the webinar. So here's also a link for you if you want to take the survey right now. Finally, we hope that you'll keep the conversation going on how we can reimagine the future of philanthropy through advocacy and lobbying and all of these other tips and tricks. So if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley at sherilyn@girs.org, and we all hope that you have an excellent day. Thank you so much for joining us today.